I'm just looking through some of the pages of this book by Jose Pagola. So some of you may remember we used this book 7 years ago when we were first talking about Jesus, and I was going back through it to see how we might use his work in talking about one of the things I think is really interesting. That is the kind of evolutionary process leading toward morality and moral living. It's a heck of a story. Oh. What was I thinking? How rude! I really apologize. Of course, I'm Michael Reinbold, and welcome to the 8th series in our adult formation project at Resurrection Catholic Parish. It's awfully good to be with you again, and I appreciate your being here. You know, we actually started, I'm saying, 7 years ago with this project. We began talking about Jesus. The second series, we talked about St. Paul and his wanderings about the Mediterranean. We talked then about the communion of saints. We started with Jesus, who's going to set the tone, as we'll talk more about in this present series. And then we talked about the communion of saints. Has that theme would run from the time of Jesus through Paul down the centuries. We talked about one of the specific parts of the communion of saints, the mystics. And then, as some of you will recollect, we talked about the Nicene Creed. We talked about love and what love got to do with it. And then in the last series that we did last year, we took a look at how the Christian life plays out in everyday life with the people around us. Remember, we saw, oh my gosh, we saw doctors, we saw attorneys, we saw sergeants with the county sheriff's office. We worked with a Greek Orthodox priest. We saw a primatologist who talked to us about chimpanzees and the incredible place that they play within the entire structure of the evolutionary process down to the present day. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the notion of history and how history plays into all of this. Oh, in fact, I'll tell you what. Here, come with me. You'll notice that we, in fact, today are in a cemetery. And not just any cemetery, but a really important one to me and to my family. Come with me and we'll talk a little bit about this as we go. I'm mentioning the idea of history and how important history is and how important the concept of history is that we understand who we are. In many ways, we really only understand who we are by seeing where we have come from, who the people are that we've dealt with over our own lives, and through the long course of time. We'll come back to this in just a moment, but I bring you to this lovely little cemetery for another reason. Here, come with me. Of all things, this is the headstone of one of my dear sons. He unfortunately passed away in an automobile accident a number of years ago. All of life as it is right now, is part of my proximate history, this history. There's lots of different kinds, as we were talking. There's ancient history. In fact, there's very, very ancient history. We'll talk about that in a little bit also. And then there's history that's kind of in between that, and the proximate history is the right here and now. As I said, this is my son's headstone, but before too long, in fact, notice there's another space right here. That's really part of my proximate history because this space is reserved for me. All of us along the course, when we come to the end of the trail, will have this part of our history tied up, as it were. But as human beings, interestingly enough, our history doesn't stop with our proximate history right here and now in a gravesite. Instead, we can also look down the road to our anticipated or even hoped for history. In religious terms, this can include, for instance, the idea of eternity at some place, some time, as we continue on with our long journey. Well, as I said, I was looking back through some of these pages, and I was noticing that one of my, I thought kind of an interesting quote was from, of all people, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, "History cannot exist without the discipline of imagination." Imagination to make history come alive and be real for us. When we talk about morals or morality, we might look at the word itself and see what does that mean? Well, it comes from, of course, an old Latin word, mos moris. And moris or mos means tradition, customs, way of life. That will then be used in English when we talk about mores, for instance, conditions and ways of life. But it also, in a broader sense, focuses on the idea of morality. The proper way to live our life, our traditions, and our cultures. One of the most famous uses of the word mores in ancient writings was Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was a contemporary of Julius Caesar 2,000 years ago. He engaged in a diatribe against a gentleman named Catilina, who had set about to actually overthrow the Roman Republic. Cicero found out about this, and he excoriated him in front of the entire Senate, which was a very big deal. Oh my goodness. And one of his phrases that he used was, "O tempora, o mores." Oh, the times, oh, the morals. Wow, we've allowed ourselves to come to this point. Well, in some ways, the present world in which we are living could recall old Marcus Tullius, O tempora, O mores. Oh my goodness. How in the world did this concept ever develop in the human experience? This concept of morality, of living life in a very particular manner. We're always surrounded by the history of our lives. We always are. We can't help it. As I mentioned, some is extremely old, some of it is in between, some of it is very proximate. We might even call down the road potential histories I was referring to earlier. However, we don't want to spend too awful much time on that. Let's take a look at the long course of history. And you may say to yourself, why in the world would I want to look at the long course of history? Because when we're talking about morality, or when we're talking about who we are as human beings, we're talking about the history of ourselves, of our families, of our ancestors, and of the ancient times from long, long ago. Out of necessity, if we're going to talk about the ancient times, we're talking about billions of years. Billions of years. Some of you may remember Everett Dirksen, Senator Dirksen, back in the 1960s, I think. And he had said one time when he was working on the federal budget, he says, well, what do you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about a lot of money. To most of us, $1 billion would be a lot of money. How far is a billion? What would it take to count to a billion? Here's an interesting thought. If I were to start right now, counting from 1 to a billion, and I counted 1, 2, 3, 1 second intervals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How long do you suppose it would take me to get to a billion? It would take me 31 and a half years to get to a billion. 31 and a half years to get to a billion at 1 second intervals. Oh, and remember, that's with no snoozing, no napping, no potty breaks. 31 and a half years. It's a huge number. And yet, when we talk about the expanse of the universe and the expanse of time and whatnot, it's a common occurrence. As we know, the original source of this part of the galaxy, this part of the universe, started with a bang, a very big bang, in fact, about 14 billion years ago. Wow. Well, then this part right here that was part of the collapse of a major star formulating the planets and the sun and everything else in this little part of the Milky Way galaxy, that was about 4 billion years ago. Okay. So there's a 10 billion year gap from the Big Bang until this planet, the solar system, would begin to fall into place. Okay. A mere 500 million years later, is that crazy? A mere 500 million years later, life would develop on this little planet, in this solar system, in this spiral wing of the Milky Way galaxy. 3.5 billion years ago. And then, of course, as we know from our histories and whatnot, about 65, 66 million years ago, the big reptiles became, as it were, history. The mammoth asteroid, 8 miles wide, would crash into the Yucatan Peninsula right on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. And that would, in essence, wipe out the big life. It could not survive. Think of this. With that initial impact, a tsunami was set up more than a mile high. We think of tsunamis as rolling across at feet, or maybe 100 feet, a mile high. That impact, in fact, will impact the entire globe. Unbelievable, but true. And once again, the big reptiles would be gone. Food would be gone. Life as they knew it would be gone. Absolutely remarkable. However, that opened up some really interesting possibilities. With the big reptiles gone, the little mammals that had thrived, although not on the same scale as the big guys, of all things, now it was their turn. And they began an evolutionary process that, in fact, will come down through 66 million years, eventually to life right here in the great Pacific Northwest. Is that simply phenomenal? Primates and whatnot will have developed after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And about 5 million years ago, primates which had already evolved into a sort of the great apes, one of the individual groups in that would step away from the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, and would begin its own separate path. Not intentionally. This is the way that the evolutionary process works. That individual, that group, whatever, as they would begin, would go down to about 200,000 years ago. Now we're talking about, modern times, 200,000 years in terms of billions and billions. But at 200,000 years ago, in the middle of the Paleolithic age, of all things, our very DNA would begin, that eventually would be found in every human being on the face of the earth today. We can trace our history as humans back to one female. There were lots of other females, but one female that her line endured right down till today. Every human being on the planet, everyone, has DNA that relates back to that one female about 200,000 years ago. Well, there were lots of other females, but their lines went extinct through the course of time for whatever reasons. But here we are. And then even more remarkable things happen. Well, that's how we get down to 200,000 years ago. But perhaps the most exciting part is yet to come. A mere 30 to 50,000 years ago. As we can see when we're talking about billions and billions, 30 to 50,000 years is like yesterday, of course. But about 30, 50,000 years, something like that, a truly remarkable thing happened in this community of bipedal mammals. Something took place that will change not only the course of that evolutionary line, but the entire planet, over and over again. What could it possibly be? Can you imagine what, in the whole process of evolution, what one event could have happened that would change absolutely everything? Syntactical language. Language would change absolutely everything. How might language have developed? Well, let's say everything at that time was tribes and small clans, small groups of individuals. They were hominids. In fact, there was Homo sapiens by that particular time. Let's say, for instance, some linguists think that this may well be what happened. Let's say that that tribe had a sound for danger. How about wah, 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 meaning danger? That very sound may have been used for thousands of years. Wah, wah, wah. Instantly, when that would be heard, immediately people would start looking around and getting into the trees, whatever is necessary to protect themselves. But what if one day, how did this ever happen, some individual decided that he could modify that sound. And he might have said, wahi, wahi, wahi. Oh, wahi. Now, wah was the danger. Let's say he represented, let's say, a lion. Wahi, wahi. A little modifier, just a little modifier like that. All of a sudden, we're not just talking danger, we're talking a specific kind of danger. Or what if somebody started yelling, wah-ho, wah-ho, wah-ho? Perhaps the ho sound was a large snake of some sort, a leopard, a buffalo, something else of danger. That simple act, seems to us simple act, of modifying that noun, simple act, would change everything. Because now, for the first time, imagine this, for the first time, instead of simply making noises, we know many other animals do, instead of making noises and whatnot that in fact would signify dangers or such things as that, now not only a sound could be important, the beginning of language would allow not just the sharing of things like danger signals, it would begin the process that would take, as we've seen, tens of thousands of years to share ideas. Once Homo sapiens could share ideas, not just noises, not just the scare thing, whatever, but ideas, everything changed. Why? Because with the sharing of ideas, you can start to expand outside of your little tribe or your little clan. You can begin to form larger communities based on ideas and of taking care of one another. We know many other animals will take care of one another, and this was certainly the case with early Homo sapiens. But most often that caring only referred to, in fact, the little tribe, the family, the clan. But with the advent of language, suddenly, well, not suddenly exactly, of course, we're looking at a long evolutionary period, but suddenly, let's say, you could share ideas and you could share concepts that would lead to community. Carl Sagan, one of my favorite science writers, had a wonderful saying. He says, "The only thing we found to make emptiness bearable was each other." Emptiness bearable. Think of what it would have been like for those hundreds of thousands of years with your own, just your little tiny clan, your little group. And what a change it would have been when suddenly the world opened up and you began communicating, actually sharing ideas, thoughts, possibilities with others. This will lead, of course, as you can well imagine, to the advent of agriculture, and eventually it will lead to the Industrial Revolution. Wow. And what we have seen in both of these examples, especially take the Industrial Revolution, is that once things start to change, they change very rapidly. That's what we are able to do as human beings. Once things start to change, they can change very rapidly. Modern technology, of course, is a prime example of that. You have an iPhone 13, well, that'll never do. You know, there's a 14 out. I was living on my iPhone 6 for years and years before I found out I really had to change. Oh, okay, why? Things moved on. Things expanded. That's what it means, to be able to think and to lead others as well. This is all really interesting stuff, I think. It certainly leads us to some very interesting conjunctions and whatnot that we have to think about. And one of the things that it's going to lead to that I think we should be cognizant of and kind of keep in mind is once this starts to happen, once these ideas start to be shared, you also have to be careful of where you are getting your ideas. Where you're getting your ideas, no kidding. Yeah, because not everything is true, is it? Not at all. And ideas tend to come from someone we trust. I'll tell you a story. I spent many, many years teaching in high school. One year I was teaching actually the history of theater. And I was explaining the progress of theater through the years, BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini. As soon as I said Anno Domini, one of the young ladies put her hand up and said, no. I said, no what? She said, no, that's not right. I said, what's not right? She said, whatever you said that AD thing is, that's not right. I said, really? Well, what do you think the AD means? And she said, well, after death. And I figured I knew who she was talking about, but I said, well, after whose death? And she said, well, Jesus, of course. And I said, oh, okay, so BC is before Christ, AD is after death. Don't we have a chunk of time in there that's not accounted for? And she said, I don't care, that doesn't matter, it means after death. And so I said, well, why do you think that? And then she said something to me that helped me understand huge portions of human life. She said to me, my grandma told me. There you have it. Grandma was the authority. Grandma loved her. Grandma would never do anything to harm her. She would only look out for her best interests. Why would she not believe everything Grandma told her? Who is the grandma in my life? How about you? Who is the grandma in your life? Who says things that you take in that you're going to believe no matter what? That's a huge thing. Come, let's sit down for a second. You know, in some ways, this whole notion of living in kind of a clouded time of truth, I find to be really fascinating. It reminds me of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. Remember, he starts off, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In other words, pretty much like every other time. We have to be careful where we find our truths. You know, how do we determine the truths and whatnot in life? Well, we're going to tackle that soon enough, but let's go back to one of the things we were talking about a little earlier with the advent of language about 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. One of the things we should remember also that by that time in the whole Paleolithic period, coming down from about 300, 250,000 years ago, Homo sapiens would have evolved to the point that we would recognize those people. Here's an example. Here's an example of a facial reconstruction that was done on a skull found from the Paleolithic age. Now look at that face. This is a woman that you would recognize in the grocery store when you're on your hunter-gatherer expedition for bread and milk and maybe a nice bottle of Merlot. How about that? Looked amazingly like us. We would recognize that person. Well, with the advent, as we're talking, of language and this whole new way of being, some absolutely remarkable things happened within a very short period of time. Within a period of slightly over 3,000 years. Remember, we started off with 14 billion, 4 billion, 350 billion, 5 million, 250,000, 30 to 50,000. Wow. All these huge numbers. But within a very short period of time, as I said, about 3,000 years, think of the things that had developed. Let me give you a list. Consider these key markers. The Code of Hammurabi, about the 18th century BCE, before the Common Era, or BC before Christ. How about the Upanishads and the Vedas, 1500, 1600 BC. How about the Hebrew Scriptures? Hebrew Scriptures, 8th to 7th century BC. What? Wow, that's remarkable. That's almost now. And the sacred, the Hebrew Scriptures, some of their basis comes right out of the time of Sargon the Great and the Akkadians. Some of the stories that we find in the Hebrew Scriptures. Well, and then we get to, for instance, Gautama Buddha, the Buddha who's living in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. How about Confucius, the 6th and 5th centuries BC? How about Lao Tzu and Taoism, the 6th century BC? How about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all within 5, 4 3rd centuries BC? And then we come to perhaps the key moral person in Western civilization. We come to Jesus, or as St. Paul will call him, Jesus the Christ. Oh my goodness. All of this made possible by the advent of language. I would posit that this leads us to a most remarkable writing, and that would be the Gospel of St. John. Remember how the Gospel of St. John begins. In Principio Erat Verbum, et Verbum erat apud Deum, et Verbum erat Deus. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Language, keyed by words, brought by John right into the midst of life. In the beginning was the Word. Oh my gosh. How all these pieces are tied together and work as one. Jesus, at least in the Christian experience, was the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the summation, all of it. All of this that began 3.5 billion years ago with life on this little rock, or as Carl Sagan put it, this tiny blue dot. All of it there, and yet here we are, in search of the trek for morality and the evolutionary of moral principles. Absolutely remarkable. Well, next time we'll take a quick look at what life would have been like in the time of Jesus, because remember last spring, many people in the parish participated in the small group sessions built on the life of Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. So let's take a quick look at the world surrounding Jesus at the time. And then, I think you'll find this absolutely fascinating. I'm eager myself. We'll take a look at 5 different aspects in which, in fact, Jesus would bring to life in his time and right down to the present time what it meant to be a moral person. We're going to again base our work on Jesus and historical approximation by Jose Pagola. Talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll take a look at 5 different ways in which Pagola recognized what Jesus did as it would relate right down to our present day. I can't wait. I can't wait to share all of this with you. I think we will have a marvelous time together for these 8 sessions, and I look forward to being with you and then to meet with our Zoom connections and discussions on Saturday evenings. Once again, welcome to the 8th series, and as always, blessings always.